Good morning and welcome to today's Friday Forum. The forum focuses on neoliberalism and higher education, and today's forum features the topic of shared governance, and we have three faculty members from Michigan State University who will be speaking on shared governance at MSU and in higher education generally. We recognize that this is a period of tremendous crisis across the country, and that usually leads to reconfiguration of societal institutions and so on, and that is likely to occur as well in higher education. But we're going to speak about shared governance generally in terms of structures and processes for collegial decision making as it occurs in higher education, knowing full well that there are other institutions that also engage in shared governance. Primarily, nursing sector does a lot of that. We know that there are competing definitions of shared governance and that it varies, the specific configuration varies from institution to institution. What we're talking about in good shared governance is the alignment of priorities with the input of faculty on administration and board of trustees in terms of moving the institution forward and addressing the issues and challenges that they face. We're talking about achieving a win-win governance structure and process that is characterized by trust, by goodwill, and by commitment to common values. This requires that all of us recognize the system as legitimate and fair, knowing full well that it is a form of shared power within the institution, and that sometimes there are persons who are unwilling to share that power just by nature of their personality. So now I will turn to our speakers. We have three. One is Frank Fier, and they will be presenting in the order by which I will introduce them. Another is Andaluna Borcila and Stephen Gasteyer. Frank will be speaking on history erased. I think that's a very specific discussion relative to Michigan State University, but also about what's happening in shared governance generally. Andaluna will speak on faculty voice in shared governance, its importance and role. And Stephen Gasteyer will be speaking on rebuilding shared governance. Andaluna and Stephen are both currently involved in shared governance or academic governance structures here at Michigan State University. And so before I get to that, let me just say a little bit about each one. Frank is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Community Sustainability in the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources. He received his doctorate degree from Iowa State, I should say, 1977, and served for many, many years here at MSU. He has served in various roles, including academic and administrative roles, and has been actively engaged in education still during his retirement. He is the former president and CEO of the Greater Lansing Food Bank and a founding member of the Capital Area Food Security Coalition. He studies and writes in many different areas, but one of his recognized pieces is on coming to critical engagement, a volume that speaks to community engagement by the university, in which he is the lead author. Andaluna is associate professor at James Madison College here at MSU, with affiliations with the Center for Gender and Global Context. She focuses mostly on post-Cold War cultural and literary studies, including television, narratives of immigration and return, and travel writing. And she is the author of American Representations of Post-Communism, Television, Travel Sites, and Post-Cold War Narratives, which was published in 2014. And Stephen Gasteyer is also associate professor. He's in the Department of Sociology here at MSU, has a joint appointment with Ag Bio Research, and has numerous affiliations with different centers and academic units here on campus. He received his doctorate from Iowa State as well, and Andaluna got it from Purdue University. Stephen concentrates mostly on community development, environmental justice, and political ecology of landscape, including water issues, and has done a lot of work in the Middle East. He is very interested in potable water and sanitation here in the United States, and also in Tanzania and other parts of the globe. So with that, let me turn it over to Frank, who will speak on History Erased. Frank?
Thank you very much, Ruben, and good to see all my colleagues. And to all of those who may be watching, we appreciate your taking the time. When we first got together to talk about this session, I think it was back in October of 2019, as I was listening to my colleagues talk, I wrote History Erased on my notepad because it reminded me of the history of Michigan State University in relationship to how it has evolved over the years. For reference, I joined the faculty at MSU in 1978 and was involved, as Ruben mentioned, in a variety of roles through 2012. And so, in fact, as I walked back to my car that day and thought about our conversation, I decided to actually put pen to paper and write an article, which you'll find in a statewide, nonpartisan, nonprofit public policy publication called The Bridge. And if you do a Google search, Frank Fear, The Bridge, you'll find it. And the title, and I have to look at it, it's been a while, How Michigan State Lost Its Way and Why the Future Holds Promise. And let me just share some words from the beginning of the article, which I think is clearly pertinent, at least I see it, to today's conversation. Decades ago, I have to emphasize that, decades ago, old-fashioned consultation and engagement was a hallmark of how Michigan State did business. Executive management established meaningful ongoing relationships with faculty and used input, advice, and counsel to move the university forward. You know, very simply put, that was an administrative choice among many administrative choices in terms of how to proceed. What I didn't realize back then was how fragile this was. I assumed, wrongfully so, that this was the way it is and it won't change. And I realize now that it has changed. It did change. And I think that's why this session is so important. And I'm not talking about academic governance per se, although what happened then and what has transpired since has significant influence on academic governance. To be more specific, I'm talking about institutional governance, shared governance with respect to the institution. You know, and I had a conversation with a colleague at Cornell a few weeks ago, and one of the points we talked about was the fact that if there is not a significant degree of shared governance, institutional directions before this pandemic hit, don't expect it to emerge during the pandemic. And we're seeing around the country different approaches being taken with respect to how fiscal challenges will be met. I mean, many of us, I think, know what's happening at Ohio University, which is a very significant experience. If you're not familiar with it, I would ask you to Google Ohio University and see what's happening there. Other universities have announced what they're going to be doing. Northwestern recently, Duke, I think just yesterday, Michigan State's involved. In some cases, these cuts are just announced. In other cases, there is engagement with faculty, staff, and in sometimes students. Let me talk a bit about what Michigan State was like back then. When I talk with younger colleagues about what I'm going to describe now, they look at me because they had no idea that any of this happened. Remember, the title of this is History Erased. And it is news to them. It's ancient history. And in fact, we're talking about an approach that was in place almost 30 years ago. Perspective. Back then, David Scott was provost. He went on to become president of University of Massachusetts Amherst. John DiBiagio was president. He went on to become a chancellor, I believe, at Tufts University. And they were both very much committed to broad-based and deep faculty engagement in the directions of the university and in decision-making generally. And the way that they went about it is that they identified, very simply, a set of priority planks and then invited faculty to serve on committees that would engage, the faculty would engage in deliberation, dialogue and deliberation, and then deliver the outcome of their thinking to the central administration for action. I'm talking about a very broad-based set of planks. For example, institutional diversity. There was an initiative called the MSU IDEA, which stood for Institutional Diversity, Excellence in Action. There was another plank called COURAGE. All of these had very interesting acronyms associated with. COURAGE stood for the Committee on Research and Graduate Education. There was CREW, which stood for the Committee on Undergraduate Education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes those who served, the names were vetted through academic governance. In other cases, there was direct appointment by the provost. And what's really important is that important things came out. There was a comical aside. The university decided to have a banner with respect to the commitment to faculty, staff, and students. And so they came up with a slogan that said, "At MSU, people count." Well, it didn't take very long before you saw bumper stickers around town that said, "At Michigan State, people count. At the University of Michigan, they can divide." So that's what happened. So it was changed from "At MSU, people count" to "At MSU, people matter." And so, but let me just say that a number of very meaningful things came out of these deliberations. For example, many people don't know, even though Michigan State is a top 10 doctoral granting institution, that it wasn't until the mid-90s, when I came, from the time I came in 78 to 92, we did not have a graduate school. We had a graduate office. And one of the things that Courage recommended was that we needed a graduate school with leadership for the graduate program. And that was approved, and a dean was appointed. Many of you may know Karen Klimperens by name, and Karen became the second dean of the graduate school. Another thing that was very important is that one of the things that the institution wanted faculty to wrestle with was something that is very important with respect to the public eye, and that's athletics. And there was a committee called SPARK, which stood for Spartan, let me see if I can get it right, Spartan Athletic Review. That's what it stood for. And what came out of that was a recommendation for the role of women in athletics administration. Michigan State then hired a woman as athletic director, which was a first for Michigan State. I think there are a couple of things that I would have as takeaways from this, and that is that very meaningful things came out of those deliberations. It wasn't done for symbolic purposes. Not all of these reports, in fact, very few of them, you'll find online. Ruben and I searched recently for the MSU IDEA report. And I will say this from a personal perspective, that priority, that initiative, the MSU IDEA, is the one that I miss the most, because what it did, it talked about the importance of institutional diversity and pluralistic perspectives as being a hallmark of the university. As I said earlier, that report included 50 recommendations for how to advance the institution from a diversity perspective. All of this was an administrative choice among many administrative choices. And what happened? Why did it go away? Well, I think the simple answer is when administrations change, new administrations come in, and one of the things that new administrators sometimes do, and I'd be lying if I didn't say I have engaged in that activity when I was in administration, you essentially advance what you think is important, and then you underplay what was there before. But I think there is a macro explanation going on here that relates to the host of this particular conversation, neoliberalism in higher education. Back in the 80s, there was a socio-political and economic mantra that was gaining steam worldwide. It was emphasized by Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain with her famous slogan, "Tina, there is no alternative." Ronald Reagan in the United States embraced that. And it had a variety of different interpretations. It included, less government. But the core, one of the core beliefs was a belief in markets and a belief in market behavior and the emphasis on competition among competitors as a survival and advance of the fittest. It took a while, I would submit, for what we know today as neoliberalism, and Henry Goulet is one of the academics who's written extensively on the implications of neoliberalism in higher education. Excuse me, Henry Giroux. But the fact of the matter is, back then, very, very few of us, those of us who weren't students of neoliberalism, even knew what the concept meant and didn't refer to it in higher education. Basically, it was referred to in a very innocuous way, and that is, we're going to run higher education as a business. And that's essentially what happened. And with the transfer of responsibility administratively from DiBiagio and Scott to Peter McPherson as president, Luana Simon as provost, and with Joel Ferguson on the board of trustees, what we really now, I think, see through the rearview mirror is that Michigan State embraced a neoliberal ethic in both theory and practice, philosophy and practice, quite significantly. And let me read again from that Bridge article to share my thoughts. Higher education began being led and managed more like a corporation and less like a public institution. A business model organized around competitive advantage, peer ranking, and money, grants, and philanthropy. Michigan State did not have a vice president for essentially fundraising until around 1979. So you can see the shift here. All of those things, competitive advantage, money and markets, became the coin of the realm. And universities began operating like athletic teams. Winning mattered, and everything else was less critical, despite frequent rhetoric to the contrary. In true neoliberal fashion, it was really about money, markets, and competition, survival, and advance of the fittest. And I recall, as I wind down this presentation, being invited, quote unquote, it was an or else invitation back then. And there was an invited speaker who was vice president of a national standing organization. And he made a presentation about what Michigan State needed to be. And I thought about it again when Ruben gave his introduction. It was all about alignment, that the president and the provost make the decisions. The deans are then instructed to carry it out. The chairs must follow suit and manage accordingly. And I remember I wrote this down that is a good organization. That's what a good organization is. And I left that day thinking, no, that's not what a good organization is. That's what the organization you want to be. And there's a big, big difference. Recently, and I shared this with Andaluna and Stephen, there was an article in the Inside Higher Education written by a university president. And she talked about the importance of shared governance. And I want to share this with you. Her name is Marjorie Haas from Rhodes College in Tennessee. And let me read the words that she opened up her essay with. She says, shared governance was effective at my institution because we enacted it on a well-established foundation of transparency, trust, and inclusion. Without these ongoing commitments, shared governance fails in both ordinary and extraordinary times. And she goes on to say, there are three key aspects to shared governance. They're very important, and they're very basic. Number one, be transparent in communicating the financial realities of your school's business model. Second, build a culture of trust with faculty, staff, and student leaders, and involve them in a conversation about big picture issues, including institutional goals and priorities. And third, create inclusive teams so that multiple perspectives can be considered, including perspectives you don't want to hear. Let me close by saying this. I do think that higher education has become a neoliberal institution. In fact, I wouldn't even use the word institution. It's become a neoliberal corporation, a neoliberal industry. I would use the words that Margaret Thatcher coined many decades ago. There is no alternative. But I'd flip that. Today, there is no alternative other than shared governance. Thanks, Ruben.
Thank you, Frank. Really appreciate that. Our next speaker is Andaluna Borcila. She will be speaking on faculty voice in shared governance. Andaluna?
Hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be here and engage in a conversation with all of you as much as this medium allows. Just a couple of things about myself. I teach at James Madison College, which is it's a place in the university that's a bit unique in the sense that it's a residential college. It puts teaching at its center, and there's a lot of interaction between faculty and students, which also leads to the possibility of forming certain kinds of alliances, and I'll touch on one in a second. I'm also a member of the Faculty Senate, as Ruben said, and I have been a member since 2017, and I think I should signal the fact that Faculty Senate has become a more happening place as in the last couple and a half years, and I'll mention some of the things that have happened on Senate. But if we think about Senate, it's a place in which I think what we see is the emergence of a voice that tries to articulate itself as a collective faculty voice, and at the same time, a clear indication of how we as faculty can also work to undermine our own voice, and how the structure and policies in place can undermine it as well. And I also am a core member of an alliance, faculty student staff alliance called Reclaim MSU. Reclaim was formed in the aftermath of the public testimonies of Nassar survivors and the university's failure to respond to, and the egregious ways in which it did respond to Nassar survivors. But Reclaim also has focused on and engaged with, in terms of our actions, interviews we've done with the media, and proposal with challenging the culture of complacency at MSU, and with challenging the opacity at MSU, and with an ideal of shared governance. So, and to be specific about how we saw issues, I mean, we look at these issues of culture and policies and structure as linked. We have, for instance, a proposal that we wrote. It was one of the first things we did as an alliance. It was a collaborative effort. It is a proposal for shared governance. It has different parts to it. And you can get to it on our website, which is still sort of active. This proposal was also endorsed by Faculty Senate a couple of years ago, which we thought was really important, but then it went nowhere, which is something that we need to think about. It was also a proposal that was signed by over 1,000 people from our community who signed our petition. And so, I just want to make the point that Reclaim has also worked on trying to build a space, a platform, a voice that we think was missing from, and almost impossible to articulate within the culture and the infrastructure of academic governance at MSU. So we've tried to use that. I have many thoughts swirling in my head. I'm not ashamed to say that, though I tend to be a very organized person, and one has to be in order to do all the kinds of things we do on a daily basis, and to also be parents, for instance, and eat and so forth. And I would have started my comments differently a few weeks ago. So there's a different path that I would have taken. I would have started my comments a few weeks ago with what's been happening on Senate, the pressure of this new emerging voice, and then how it's been stifled and the possibilities there. But instead, I'm going to start somewhere else. I will start in a different place, though eventually I will come to Senate. My thoughts today are less organized, and so I want you also to think that there's a performative aspect to this, but also really there's also exhaustion. I don't want my thoughts to wrap anything up. I want them to open things up to conversation, and I'm also very exhausted, and I just do want to emphasize the fact that I'm not embarrassed of being exhausted. I'm not embarrassed to say that I'm exhausted. Oftentimes, as people who work in academia, this is either a badge or honor of that we're exhausted, or it's something we're ashamed to articulate. It's as if we didn't have these human, aspects to our lives. And I believe that one of the things that the institution has done is encouraged us to lose that sort of human dimension of who we are and of who each other are, except for in a very sort of particular kind of individualistic way that I'm going to get to in a second. And I am so exhausted because of what's been happening since COVID at our institution, which is the shift to online, and the fact that I'm a parent and I have a 10-year-old who no longer has school. But I'm also exhausted because, like many of us at this institution, we've had an ongoing institutional crisis that we've tried to respond to, and this has taken a toll on us. But we're not just victims, so what we have done is try actually to respond to, and that impacts where we find ourselves and our voice. I want to actually start with what happened with the shift to online classes and some thoughts about how that happened as far as I can tell, because lots of things are a mystery in terms of how things work at our institution, which is one of the problems that we're faced with. And then what happened to us in that shift and what didn't happen, what we know and what we don't know. So that's going to be sort of my first set of comments around that site. Because I think it's important to map where we're at, and that if we think specifically about where we're at, we can get to some problems that face us, and we can pose some questions about how we could imagine things could be different. And so we were informed a few days before the online shift happened that the president is considering and working on with other people the possibility of an online shift. We didn't quite know who the work was being done with and what this really means, but things were happening very fast. And then boom, we were informed on a Wednesday, I think, morning, that the shift will happen Wednesday afternoon. I have some questions. Were faculty engaged in how and when this would happen? Was the decision to shift classes in the middle of the day compared to, for instance, the decision that other schools have made to cancel classes for a few days, regroup, consult, and see the best way to move forward? Was that, a better decision, the one that was made here? Would faculty have advised differently? Had they actually been part of a conversation or consulted about, how this shift should happen, and once it did, about important aspects that should be taken into consideration, for instance, such as student and faculty access to the technology that we need in order for this shift to happen successfully? I don't know the answer to these questions, but I think posing these questions is very important. I'll ask another one. Would we have had more time to regroup and think about how to modify would it have been better had we had a bit more time to regroup and think about how we would modify our content so that the learning that we offer our students and our own health, would have been better? I think it's difficult to think about what could have been and should have been. The exercise that I'm doing above, but I think it's a really important exercise. But part of the reason why I think it's difficult to think about what could have been and should have been done is because of the unprecedented crisis we are in. The other difficulty here is that we don't know, in fact, what happened. And we also don't know what will happen next. So there's this fear that lots of people have. And then there is this, in my opinion, it is difficult to understand how faculty can actually be engaged and contribute rather than be told what to do. And it is sometimes very hard for us to, in fact, articulate in what ways would our being part of shared governance specifically make things different. But I think it's really important that we think about that, and that we articulate that. Now, particularly at this point in time in which our concerns about shared governance can be very easily dismissed because, things are serious and decisions need to happen fast, and particularly at this institution, though of course it's happening all across the country, where our recent history of shared governance is null, particularly at a point in time in which we have this story that's been around, but it's getting reasserted, that faculty are so slow in figuring out what they want, and that they don't understand budgets, and that faculty governance structures are cumbersome, and it takes too long for that process. And again, decisions need to be made fast. But as I also want to think about how we responded to the shift to online classes as faculty. And I want to personalize this because I think it is important that we do so and not generalize, but also because I think that the way in which the shift happened for many of us is that we were left to deal with it on our own, drawing on our own networks, and we hunkered down and we did what we had to do to make what we needed to do happen, which is our teaching and our research as best we could. In my case, I benefited from the help of our IT guy. Thankfully, we have him, and I appreciate his help. But how did we respond? Well, faculty, staff, and students had to shift everything we knew about how to do things in a few hours, and to continue to work to figure out how learning and living can happen. Many of our first response, again, was to hunker down to get the job done. But what happened to our faculty bodies? Initially, what happened is they canceled their meetings. So at a time in which we would have needed that kind of collective reckoning and coming together to figure out what do we as faculty do, what can we do in these circumstances, the meetings were canceled. Now, I don't want to fault individual people for this, but I do think this is an indication of where we're at. I can find many reasons why these meetings were canceled. In fact, initially, I was so grateful I didn't have to attend another meeting while I was trying to survive. But at the same time, that question was very much nagging me. Why are the meetings canceled? People who are in academic governance and leadership roles, such as, for instance, of the Faculty Senate, are very busy people. The logistics of putting these meetings together was difficult. But I think that something else was going on as well. And, at one point, I'd like to draw Anna into this. But what I want to think about here is the fact that we didn't turn to our bodies as a way of addressing the situation. Like, that is not what we did as a faculty. And we didn't do so for reasons that also, I think, have to do with something that Stephen is going to talk about, which is that many of us don't think about governance, participating on committees and in our structures as participating in governance. Many of us think about it as doing service, okay? And service is something that is at the bottom of what gets rewarded. But there's another aspect to this as well, which is that many of us are tired of putting a lot of time and effort into something that we take seriously as service and seeing that our efforts go nowhere. So there's also this sort of sense of uselessness. At the same time, some of us continue to put effort into this, but there was no desire or sense of the fact that we as a faculty have a body that we need to turn to, that can help us figure out, and that we have a voice that we can use to engage with what's going on at this university. Having said that, yes, meetings were canceled, and that is very significant, but it's also significant that because some of us weren't comfortable with that and pushed back, the meetings were reinstated, right? So you see, there is that's also going on now. How were they reinstated? And I'm gonna just shift to that and talk a little bit about that via webinar. There are many problems with this format, and if we continue to function virtually, one of the things we need to think about is what to ask for specifically, and how that reduces faculty voice. Again, we already had a big problem with faculty voice. And in fact, just to mention something, Faculty Senate, the body that I talked about, that I've been active in, has come up, or a group of faculty out of their own initiative, I'm not part of that specific group, has come out with very specific ideas to address the ways in which the format of Senate, the structure of the meeting, the timing of topics on the agenda of Senate work to constrain faculty participation and governance and faculty voice. They did that last summer and had proposals for Senate now. So that has to do with not the virtual format, but the one we had, on a regular basis. So they had really good, real good set of proposals there. But then what happened too is that they kind of went nowhere, and we should, talk about what that is. Additionally, we're faced with a new format now, the virtual format, a webinar in which what happened initially was our voices could literally be muted. And then the person who makes decisions about who talks is the tech person. You can use that as a metaphor too. I think each one of these things can be used as a metaphor of where we're at with voice and shared governance now, excuse me. But I do want to say a couple of things about that meeting, and it poses two different issues that I think are very important for us today. And I'm sorry if I spoke too much, and I will close then, and then I can talk about Senate more if you would like later. So one of the things that happened at our webinar meetings is that, again, faculty were muted, and some of us, it was hard for us to get a voice in, right? But President Stanley, so I'm going to focus on a specific exchange, two exchanges. One, President Stanley made a comment about how he would announce when we go to online. And Anna, who's here, if I'm correct, put in chat the fact that, I hope we will deliberate this, or faculty will participate in this deliberation, that it won't just be an announcement, right? I followed up with a question then and at the next meeting. And my question was something like this. When will the time frame be that the announcement will be made? And how will you engage faculty in the process of making this decision, as well as in the process of deciding what we need to do in order to have the best teaching learning experience that we can, if we shift to online in the fall? Now, his response was basically that, so I'm going to try to sum up, and I hope I don't, present it in a very narrow way, but it was basically, there are facts, which is this virus. We don't know what's going to happen next. There are decisions, and these decisions are not, to be made within a democracy. So basically, he would make the decision. He doesn't know exactly how, and there was no discussion of a process. I came back with a question of process again, which wasn't answered, and I want to emphasize again that even if this seems futile at this point, posing this question is super important. It's very important now when we're dealing with issues of budget that we know nothing or very little about. How are those decisions being made? The president of our institution now said they're being made in consultation with academic leaders. We know there are unions out there that are negotiating on behalf of their union members, but we faculty do not have a union. So the only people he could be talking to, the only people who have any leverage, and do they really, are Faculty Senate and Faculty Senate leadership or steering committee. That's a big burden to put on that group of people. And I also want to know, how these conversations are actually happening and how much voice faculty really have in them. And when I say I want to know that, I'm not saying I want to put Anna on the spot. I'm saying we need to find answers about this. The last thing I want to comment on is another exchange that I had with our provost at this last meeting, because I think it's very relevant to where we're at today. And in response to a question that somebody posed, believe me, I don't really even remember what the question was. I think it had to do with the budget. The provost, obviously, but it could have been a much, more gentle question than a budget question. Though I guarantee to you, if it was posed as a question, it was posed in a very gentle way. So, not by me. But the provost's answer, the provost commented before she answered on what she perceives to be this hostility coming from faculty. And this lack of trust in the administration, and the fact that she's displeased with this and she doesn't understand where it's coming from. What we see is very interesting here, because yes, this is our interim provost, but she doesn't remember or doesn't know why she was brought in, right? So it's an erasure of this history, or a willful amnesia, or perhaps a lack of understanding of the position that she's occupied within the institution. I don't want to personalize this to the provost, but this is an example of something, of an attempt of historical erasure, attempt at amnesia. In my response to the provost, and I suppose we could let instances like this not challenged, but I think it's really important to articulate that recent history. I reminded her that there is a lack of trust here, because there is a history here, and that the position that she is occupying was occupied by somebody who had to leave because of the fact that she did her job in a way that was egregious and, clearly, untrustworthy. And so, this was a reminder, but, it seems that once President Stanley, who came here, out of a closed search process that, by the way, was very contentious. And there were many on Senate who, pushed back against this, and outside of Senate as well. After President Stanley came in, we were told to give him a chance. After the interim provost came, we were told to give her a chance. But this is not about individual people, though individual people can surely make a difference. This is about the fact that these individual people are put up there to indicate to us a shift in culture at MSU. The culture at MSU has not shifted. It has been a top-down culture, a culture with many problems that we have been talking about, with little transparency, with little accountability. And at this current moment, the invitation to forget that's what it has been, and the consequences that had, is a very dangerous one. And even if we feel we have no power, and even if we see that various actions that we've pushed for aren't going where we wanted them to go, we cannot abdicate responsibility. And so I just want to stop here. And I know that I've moved across a lot of different things, but I want to stop here because I've spoken a lot. Happy to pick up on anything else.
Thank you, Ana Luna. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Stephen Gasteyer. He is speaking on rebuilding shared governance. And so, Steve?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to pick up on what Ana Luna said, and I think it really flows, what Ana Luna said really flows nicely from Frank's history at Michigan State and sort of what has resulted. What I'm actually going to, but as I started thinking about that, I wanted to get at the flip side of what Ana Luna finished with, but she alluded to before, which is the challenges to engagement by faculty. Right? So on the one hand, administrators are in a situation where they don't have mechanisms of actual deliberation and engagement. On the other hand, there's a great deal of reticence about engagement from faculty. And the reason that this is usually comes down to a question of time to do. Who has time to commit to these kinds of activities? You ever run for Senate, right? Mm-hmm. Well, why is that? This doesn't come out of nowhere, right? And actually, as I thought about this, what I came back to is actually what has been one of the big fights since I arrived here at the department level, which is the process of annual review. And what I wanted to focus on was the annual review process and how that creates a certain dynamic of what one is willing to be engaged in as a faculty member in an institution like Michigan State University. So let's start with thinking a little historically. So hearkening back to Frank's discussion about annual review and where does annual review come from? Sure enough, the real issue is about post-tenure annual review. The lore, when I was going through graduate school, was that the great thing about being a professor was that you had to work like hell to get through tenure. And then once you had tenure, you could decide what it is you wanted to focus on, right? And no one bothered you. It was your job to show up and to teach, and then to do your research and to focus on other issues that you thought were important. Since starting in the 1980s, so before I got to graduate school, but certainly by the 1990s, there was a steady chorus from outside the universities that we had to do something about those lazy professors. And the notion that faculty would make tenure and then would kick back and would do nothing for the remainder of their career, drawing a big fat paycheck. And so there was this steady progression that led to increasingly legislatures and then institutions implementing systems by which they could hold faculty accountable. And we now see almost every, I can't think of an institution that doesn't have an annual review type system at this point for faculty, but they vary. So the most extreme is University of Texas now, where there's an annual review that has very significant teeth, where there's, at least in theory, a very structured mechanism of accounting for the productivity. And this is, something that Giraud and then, the late Larry Bush have referred to as the Taylorization of academia. So getting academics to think in terms of production of widgets in the form of publications and or numbers of seats in classes that give a certain score at the end of the semester. But this has been, since I arrived 10 years ago, this has been steadily implemented within Michigan State University. And I know the process has happened within social science and specifically within sociology. And so what we have done over time is to implement this system by which we explicitly rank professors within the department on the basis of a set of metrics. And over time, we were told to set up these metrics in particular ways. Now, it was devolved to the department. It was devolved to the colleges. The colleges then devolved this to the departments. The departments then went through processes by which they implemented annual review and merit systems, but with the notion that it was always to be evaluated against a particular standard for how these reviews should happen. And so in the Department of Sociology, we finally have an approved system for annual review and merit. It does involve the team of faculty who go through and evaluate each and every faculty member. and we are to evaluate on a rolling basis. So we do every 3 years for research, every year for teaching and for service. We are to give faculty effectively a rank. How did they do? And so we're looking at productivity, and there's a certain basis on which you're supposed to meet. If you aren't in my department, if you have a normal 40% teaching, 40% research, 20% service, if you are not producing on average 2 publications a year, then you are below, you are not meeting expectations, right? Likewise, teaching, you have certain things that you are supposed to be meeting. There's scores on student evaluations. If your teaching falls below whatever the mean is on those scores, you are not. And the committee goes through and ranks professor, then add an R1. Everyone knows the culture is that, of course, what you're looking at first is research productivity. Number of grants, number of publications. Are those publications in the right kinds of journals? Then we can look at teaching, because we've been told that's going to be increasingly important. And then is somebody actually serving what they said they were going to serve? That is the extent to which we do service. And so it is, service gets downplayed. These other 2 parts, which are what theoretically bring resources to the university. So again, hearkening back to university as a business, that's what that is what we rank most significantly. What this does, if we get to this question of accountability and metrics, what does this do to faculty engagement? Well, it sends the message that engaging any more than you're supposed to may not be a good idea unless you happen to be at the end of your career and you know that you're moving out the door in the next couple of years. Because at the end of the day, at the end of the year, you're going to come in, you will be ranked based on productivity in research, acceptability of teaching, and you're doing this service stuff. At best, what you will get from doing lots of service, the kind of engagement that we talked about in terms of deliberation, is a pat on the back and a commendation that maybe you're doing a little too much. Maybe you should be focusing more on getting those research publications out the door. And to Andaluna's point, part of what this does, the way we do this ranking, because explicitly it's about ranking people within a department, is that ultimately you are in effectively competition with your colleagues down the hall, right? And so not only is it that you're supposed to meet certain bars, but if you really want to advance, you better be showing that you're a little bit better than those folks down the hall in terms of what you're producing. That means then that what the rational faculty member does is figure out how to get out of meetings, figure out how not to engage in a deliberation about what are we going to do when we go online, figure out how not to be part of that committee that's going to engage with the president. Right? Figure out how not to be on the search committee, right? So we have these systems in place that have progressed, that make it so then that we have faculty who are ranked on a yearly basis in a way that downplays service, downplays engagement. The result of that is a notion that leadership in the university is almost all positional, right? If you are going to be doing a leadership track, then what you should be doing is moving yourself into a deanship, and you should be thinking about, do you want full professor? If you don't want to make full professor, having gotten the original tenure, then it's okay to move into a deanship, but know that you will never make it to that next level in the university. If you make full professor, then you can decide that you will be on the dean's track, right? Which is a very different thing than rewarding people for being engaged in the kinds of processes that create the kind of deliberation that that the president from Rhodes College was talking about, right? For the kinds of deliberations that would create trust, goodwill, and shared purpose. Instead, you have deans and you have faculty. Faculty have their individual research to do, they have their individual teaching to do. Deans have the job of making decisions about this administrative stuff. And what I'd like to argue is that this very system breaks down, it creates a culture where you have an us versus them, because us as faculty have the job of producing widgets. They, as administration, have the job of deciding how many resources we have with which to produce those widgets. And the notion is that we're not actually on the same team. We are, at best, the foot soldiers in a military arrangement where they're the generals who are going to make decisions for us. Right? And I think unless we can start to think about other ways of doing this assessment, we are going to continue to replicate the very system that we've been criticizing for the last hour. So I'll end with that, and I think let's turn it over to conversation.
Thank you, Stephen. Let's go ahead and open it up for comments and questions. So we'll take it one at a time. Anna, you've been called on a couple of times by Andaluna. Is there any comment you'd like to make?
Yeah, essentially, I agree with what Frank and Andaluna and Stephen said. I do think that just sort of specifically in response to where we are right now, you know, we do need to think through academic governance and sort of make more clear what are the acceptable ways in which we can sort of in this one case that Andaluna mentioned, you know, cancel a meeting that happened literally while people on the steering committee were writing emails back and forth and complaining and saying we shouldn't do this. And then the email went out as this conversation was happening, a decision made by one person, which is not, you know, just that's not appropriate. And apparently it is consistent with Robert's rules of order that govern any kind of, you know, situation which isn't otherwise covered by the bylaws. So, you know, that was very troubling. I also think, you know, moving forward, how we are going to incorporate faculty voice into a range of issues that will be coming up over the summer is really important for us to think about. And yeah, I absolutely agree with Stephen about the post-tenure review. One thing that we are working on, and I don't think it's ideal, but is to bring discussions of academic governance into new faculty orientation and to emphasize, okay, so I don't like the way we're doing it on the one hand, but I actually think it is true to emphasize to new faculty that in fact making, in addition to playing an important role in academic governance, that making these connections across different colleagues within the university will sort of help you as you advance your career in terms of your research and your teaching. So to sort of try to emphasize that, you know, academic governance and service is beneficial to you as well as to the university. So, which I think is actually true, but I don't think it's necessarily an ideal way to present it. So, but yeah, I think that this is the way we're working, right? A little bit always in crisis and responding to these issues that I never would have dreamt, for example, with the cancellation of the faculty senate meeting, that someone would go ahead and do that while we are in conversation about it as a group of elected representatives.
Thank you. Jan, you've been listening. Do you have any comments or questions you'd like to ask the panelists?
Yeah, uncharacteristically quiet, right? So first of all, this was great, and I think this is just a really great example of why we need to have these conversations, because it gets your wheels spinning and thinking about important stuff. So I do have a couple of reactions and maybe even a little bit of devil's advocate on a couple of smaller points. But first of all, Frank, I could listen to you all day long. And you know, one of our benefits of our demographic is that we have a lot of institutional history, right? And just a small story, but when the pandemic started to break, I was getting a few contacts from reporters and so on about this. And I said to one, I said, well, you know, pandemic planning, pandemic scenarios have been out there in my space since the early 2000s, or about around 2005, as it turns out. And I said, you know, utilities and regulators were actually asked to do planning, and probably universities too, actually, because any critical infrastructure, major institutions should have been doing this. And this reporter was probably in her 20s, you know, was just completely dismayed. She said, you're kidding me. She thought I was making it up. And I said, no, actually, like, there were supposed to be plans. They were supposed to be annually reviewed so that we don't have to make decisions in crisis mode. And I think it just speaks to what Frank is saying. Like, if you do these things and you don't utilize them and you don't take them off the shelf and make them living, learning documents, then no wonder you get caught. So I just think it's interesting. I think there's going to be so much forensic analysis here and how this is impacting institutions and democracy, and certainly universities included. So I just agree with all the points made there. And I think there was a wonderful thread running through your three discussions. But again, I just don't think you can say it enough to remember that institutional history. Now, that said, I don't think we should also be constantly coming across as sort of nostalgic, or boy, it used to be so much nicer. And then when we were in graduate school, we had these expectations, or when I was a younger faculty, or when because I think some of the forces out there, maybe that's not the right word, but some of the change, it does cause us to innovate and to think and to try new things. And so I think we shouldn't be stuck. We do have opportunities now. And as far as the current situation, this was a public health crisis. It was an emergency. Having to make the move quickly, I don't think there was a lot of choice. Now, going forward into how we plan for the future, that's a different matter. But I think we have to give everybody a little bit of a break, that we had to be responsive. We had to be protective of public health. That was number one. Did you want to comment before I go on? Oh, unmute. You're on mute.
Yeah,
there.
I gotcha.
Okay.
So I wanted to say that clearly, I agree with the fact that there needed to be a quick decision. And I know that it's unpopular to start asking questions when quick decisions need to be made. But there were different ways in which these decisions were made. And so my questions were, specifically, was the decision to shift from morning to afternoon to online courses, rather than, for instance, what University of Michigan did or all other institutions did, which is to say, we're going to, cancel classes for the next few days or week and regroup and figure out what's the best way to move forward. So this is not really about me nitpicking that decision, but I do really think that it's really important to raise questions, particularly when we're dealing with emergency situations. And it's just because, it's not about being nitpicky. It's about, that decision was made. It was made the way it was made, and we dealt with that. That's all we did.
Right.
And so as a faculty, we can react, but we should also get used to trying to think about how things could have been done differently. And that is very healthy to do. That was my point. But we're going to be told that decisions need to be made fast and that there's no other way. There's always another way, you know, to do things, even fast. So I just want to step back. I just wanted to clarify what my point was, not to criticize fast decisions.
Right, no, and I'm not disagreeing with that. I would say, though, however, if a plan had been thoughtfully put into place ahead of time, you could have that breathing room, that time for discussion, that time for you know, so that you know, so that's the time. The time to plan is not in the middle of a crisis, okay? And the other thing I just want to remind us all of is, first of all, we're all incredibly privileged. The fact that we're even having this conversation right now demonstrates our privilege. And let's not forget about that. And let's also remember that making these changes is not for our convenience. It's for the people we serve, which are the students. And so in my case, you know, adult learners. So while, yes, I appreciate the, you know, I worry that this is, the conversation has been very faculty centric, and there's a place for that. But our job is to serve society and students. That goes back to what Frank was saying. I mean, I think we have to, you know, you have to get back to core principles and the core purpose here. So that's, to me, what should guide us versus our convenience. I think, you know, this has been incredibly inconvenient for everybody. I mean, I don't think that goes without saying. So I don't know. I would just make sure that this isn't about, you know, it isn't about us. There are bigger values here. And you know, so I just wanted to remind us of that. And, you know, and Steve, a lot of what Steve talked about definitely resonates with me. You know, I find my reviews quite amusing, you know, because now that they've let me in the door over political science, I get this review, and the first time I got it, I had a score, and it was like a number, and I had no idea of the scale, so I didn't know if it was like a good number or a really bad number, because I was like, was it a 1 to 100 scale? I didn't know, and I found out my number was actually pretty mediocre, which I thought was really amusing. And of course, like, all the things they're evaluating me on, you know, have nothing to do with my actual job at MSU. So, but so in other words, I'm over there, and I respect that. I respect the process, but I've also learned, you know, I've got to, you know, I've almost got like two parallel lives. So I'm an oddball in that sense, and I'm happy to be that, you know. But I think you're so right. Like, what you use the word, like, productive. What does it mean to be productive? That's right. And you hit the nail on the head with that. Like, how do you judge productivity? And it goes back to everything Frank said. And by the way, like, Ruben and I and Frank have talked about how there's such strong parallels around this. And I don't like to use the word neoliberal, frankly, but there's very strong parallels about how we treat essential services in society, and the stuff I work with, water, energy, you know, which has again become so apparent in the pandemic. And then just the last thing I'd say is just a point of something, again, I think we always have to keep in mind, is it's really easy to complain about stuff, right? It's really easy to talk about, I got left out, or, you know, they shortened our opportunities here, or they did this, or they did that, or they did this to us. And I think, you know, it's really incumbent on us to offer constructive solutions. If we're not happy with the way things are, you know, and this is where, again, we can draw on Frank's experience and some of those, you know, some of the great work and great thought that's happened over the years. We can draw on that, but I think we need to offer constructive solutions. I don't think this is not the time to, I guess we need to step up our game. It's not the time to just complain, because that's not going to help us, or it's not going to help the students or the future of the university. I think we need really constructive and test them out. Not everything's going to work, you know. So again, I agree with a lot. I really, really agree with all your perspectives, and I think the worst shame would be not to have lessons learned here and use those going forward. So I appreciate it.
If I could respond, I agree completely in terms of constructive responses. Brendan had to leave us, but he is a scholar of higher education. Most of the rest of us are students of higher education because this is our industry. But what strikes me, and I'm not a scholar of higher education, there is literature that has been around for a while, good literature that advises us how to proceed. For example, 30 years ago, Ernest Boyer, on behalf of the Carnegie Foundation, published a landmark book called Scholarship Reconsidered. The core of that was, let's organize a reward system in higher education around the functions that faculty members perform. You laugh because it's so damn simple. What he was saying is, we do not have a reward system that's organized around the functions that faculty members perform. So as a consequence, there are privilege dimensions and others like quote unquote service, as Andaluna said, that is not respected. And his argument is, let's change it. And with respect to Andaluna's concept about let's pause for a while, there is a very good political scientist at Bowling Green by the name of Albert Dezur. He and others have written about what's called the democratic professional. And what he argues is that many professionals do not engage with their constituents. They make calls. And his argument is, and I see this all the time in the work that I do now as a private citizen with city planners and managers, they're not democratic professionals. They basically make decisions unilaterally, and then they complain, just as Andaluna said, the provost complained, why are you complaining? Well, because those in charge are not democratic professionals. So I find this, the reason I get angry about this, we are not a waterworks, we are not making widgets, we are higher education. Why is there such reluctance to draw on the literature of higher education to lead and manage higher education? Is an endemic problem in our industry, and it's showing big time.
Thank you. I saw that Brendan was with us, and I'm sorry that he had to leave because he's also, like Andaluna and others, has young kids at home. So that took him away, but I wanted to ask him to kind of give us the big picture on this. And so that leaves it to me, and I'm going to thank all of you for your presentations and your insights. One of the things I want to say is that we are all embedded in institutions of higher education, which are embedded in larger society, which exist in a broader ecosystem in which ideology changed from, if you will, from the 80s onward. And now we're in the middle of a crisis, which I think is pushing back and revealing and making transparent a lot of the negative aspects of that new ideology that took hold over the last 40 years, in which legislators literally reduced funding to higher education because they saw higher education as a private interest, not a public good, and that people ought to pay for their own education. That led to increases in tuition. It led to students being seen as customers rather than co-creators of knowledge along with faculty. I think that was a problem. Also, remember, there's a history. What I like is that there's a history to this shift to a hierarchical exercise of authority, in which some people were really calling for the end of shared governance, that there wasn't any need for it, that there was a better way to get things done. We have seen the institutionalization of that ideology and that exercise of authority through the tailorization of our work, production of widgets, if you will, to use a metaphor that Stephen referred to, but also through the annual review process, in which things such as performance-based funding really trickled down to the faculty, right? So that's what that really is. Not only was the institution held captive to performance-based funding, but faculty themselves are embedded in that process, and they feel it every year, where you get mediocre scores or great scores or low scores or whatever. But not only has it led to hierarchical exercise of authority, we have no transparency in terms of the budget. right? So we're in the middle of a crisis. I understand that colleges and universities were receiving money from the federal government. We don't know what these institutions are receiving. And so we have to keep in mind that this movement toward a free college education today is kind of tearing apart that ideology, and faculty need to consider how that may happen. I don't know how that can be accomplished, particularly now that the economy is pretty much imploding. But those are some of the issues, and as everyone says, crises are opportunities, and sometimes they're barriers. But Andaluna, you want to say something?
Yes, I do want to say something. Thank you so much for this opportunity. What I want to say is that the situation we're in my opinion, is not the situation that we are in because we've been so critical as faculty to what has been happening in academia. It's a situation that we find ourselves in because we've been complacent. And so really what we need to do, in my opinion, is to basically work on that voice and engagement with an administration, even when, you know, we are silenced or we are told that we should not be complaining or that we should not. That is the most difficult to my mind, you know. It's the challenge for us. It's not that we've exercised our voice too much, which has led to the situation we're in. It's that we haven't exercised our voice and that there's so many impediments to exercising it and so many ways in which it's labeled and contained culturally within the institution and also structurally. So that's, you know, and I think it's really important for us to continue to develop that voice.
I appreciate that. And why don't we go ahead and conclude with that positive note and voice of encouragement that faculty need to stand up, reclaim shared governance in the university, because that's what's going to make it a stronger and much more sustainable institution in our society and to serve its original purpose, and that is to provide higher education as a public good. I want to thank all of you for your comments today, for your participation, and I wish you well for the remainder of this pandemic, however long it lasts. So take care.